For thousands of years, billions of people have lived and died by a single book. Wars have been fought over it, empires built around it. Scientists, philosophers, kings have all tried to explain it away and failed. But there's a question that almost nobody thinks to ask. Not whether it's true, not whether you should believe it. Just this one thing. Who actually wrote it? Because the answer isn't what Sunday school taught you, and it isn't what most atheists assume either. The real story involves political cover-ups, lost documents, forged letters, and a jar buried in the Egyptian desert for 1,600 years. The traditional answer is clean and reassuring. God revealed it. Holy men wrote it down. Prophets, apostles, disciples chosen for the task. The words are sacred because the source is divine. For most of history, that settled it. You didn't question where the text came from any more than you questioned gravity. It was simply there. But in 1753, a French physician named Jean Astruc was reading the book of Genesis when something stopped him cold. The same flood story appeared twice. Two different creation accounts sat side by side, and the name used for God kept switching. One passage used Yahweh, the next used Elohim. Back and forth, chapter after chapter. Astruc wasn't trying to undermine anything. He was trying to explain it. His conclusion was quiet, almost reluctant. Maybe Moses compiled this from older sources. That single idea cracked open 2,500 years of assumption. And what came next took scholars 2 centuries to untangle. By the late 1800s, German scholar Julius Wellhausen had built what became the most influential theory in biblical studies, the documentary hypothesis. The argument was simple and, to many people at the time, shocking. The first 5 books of the Bible weren't written by one person. They were stitched together from at least 4 separate documents, written by different authors in different places, across different centuries. Scholars labeled them J, E, D, and P. The J source used Yahweh as the name for God, and it reads like storytelling, vivid, earthy, full of drama. God walks in the garden. God regrets creating humanity. Scholars place it in the southern kingdom of Judah, around 950 BCE. The E source used Elohim instead, more formal, more cautious. God speaks through dreams and angels rather than showing up in person. This one came from the northern kingdom of Israel, written by priests with a different political agenda than their southern counterparts. Then came D, the Deuteronomy source. It reads like a legal code because it essentially is one. And here's the detail that changed everything for scholars. The reforms described in Deuteronomy match almost perfectly with reforms carried out during the reign of King Josiah around 621 BCE, when a scroll was discovered in the Jerusalem temple at an extraordinarily convenient political moment. Some scholars believe it was written specifically to justify Josiah's centralization of power. Others believe it was genuinely ancient. Either way, the timing is hard to dismiss. Finally, P, the priestly source. The most structured, the most formal, obsessed with genealogies and rituals and measurements and purity laws. This is the source that gives you the 6-day creation story. Everything ordered, categorized, declared good. Now, identifying these 4 sources doesn't mean the Bible is fiction. What it means is that human beings in specific political and religious contexts made deliberate choices about what to include, what to leave out, and how to arrange the pieces. But the Torah is only the beginning, because when you turn to the Gospels, the questions get even harder to answer. Around 30 CE, a man from Nazareth is crucified by the Romans. His followers scatter. Then, slowly, they regroup, and within a generation, they start writing things down. The 4 Gospels carry the names of apostles: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Those names imply eyewitnesses. People who walked with Jesus, ate with him, watched him die. The problem is the dates. Mark was almost certainly written first, somewhere between 35 and 40 years after the crucifixion. Matthew and Luke came later, probably in the 80s CE. John is the most theological, the most philosophical, and most scholars date it to 90 to 100 CE. That's a gap of 35 to 70 years between the events and the written record, in a world with no recording equipment, no printing press, no official archive, just memory, oral tradition, and communities trying to hold a movement together across the Roman Empire. And here's where it gets more complicated. Matthew and Luke both appear to have copied directly from Mark. Large passages are lifted almost word for word. They also share material that doesn't appear in Mark at all, sayings and parables that scholars call Q, from the German Quell, meaning source. Q has never been found. We don't know if it was a single written document, a collection of sayings passed between communities, or something memorized and recited across generations. But its fingerprints are in Matthew and Luke, whether we can find the original or not. Then there's John. John doesn't share Q material. John doesn't follow the same sequence of events as the other three. John's Jesus speaks differently, describes himself differently, performs different miracles. Some scholars believe John was drawing on a completely separate oral tradition. Others think it was written for a specific community, with specific theological concerns that didn't overlap with the other three. Early church tradition says Matthew wrote his gospel, Mark wrote Peter's recollections, Luke was a physician and companion of Paul, John was the beloved disciple. Mainstream scholarship today is more cautious. Most biblical scholars now believe these Gospels were compiled by educated Greek-speaking Christians who gathered the traditions of their communities and shaped them into narrative, which brings us to Paul, and the letters that scholars believe he never actually wrote. Paul wrote before the Gospels. His letters are the oldest documents in the New Testament, some dating to around 50 CE. He never met Jesus during Jesus' life, but after a conversion experience on the road to Damascus, he became the most prolific writer in the early church. 13 letters are attributed to him in the New Testament. The consensus among mainstream biblical scholars today is that only 7 of those letters were actually written by Paul. The remaining 6, including 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, show different vocabulary, different theology, and different concerns than the letters scholars accept as genuine. They appear to have been written after Paul's death by followers writing in his name. This practice was called pseudepigraphy, and in the ancient world, it wasn't considered dishonest. Writing in the name of a revered teacher was a way of extending their authority, of saying, this is what he would have taught. It happened across Greek, Jewish, and early Christian literature constantly. But it does mean that when you read Titus instructing that women should be silent in church, you may be reading a position that Paul never held, written by someone who believed Paul would have agreed. Ancient authorship simply worked differently than modern authorship. The question, who wrote this, meant something different in 80 CE than it does today. What it doesn't answer is which text made it into the Bible at all, and that story starts with a farmer and a clay jar. In December 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali was digging near a cliff in Upper Egypt when his mattock struck something hard. He pulled out a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound books, 52 texts, buried sometime in the 4th century, preserved for 1,600 years in the dry desert air. The Nag Hammadi Library, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Secret Book of John. These weren't forgeries, and they weren't fringe writings. These were texts used by real Christian communities across the early centuries. In the first 2 centuries after the crucifixion, Christianity was not one unified movement. It was dozens of movements, scattered across the Mediterranean, each circulating slightly different texts, holding slightly different beliefs, working with slightly different versions of who Jesus was and what his death meant. The process of deciding which books were in and which were out took centuries. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is often credited with this decision, but the reality is more gradual and more contested. Different bishops argued for different texts well into the 4th and 5th centuries. Letters flew back and forth. Communities resisted. By the time consensus formed, certain voices had won the argument and certain communities had lost it. The Christianity that survived and the Bible it produced reflects the theology of the groups that held institutional power. A canon is always, among other things, a record of who was in the room when the decisions got made. But even after the canon was settled, the text kept changing. Before the printing press, every copy of the Bible was made by hand, by scribes working in monasteries and scriptoria across Europe and the Middle East. Some were highly trained professionals, some were not. Scholars have identified hundreds of thousands of textual variants across the more than 5,000 surviving Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Most are trivial: a spelling difference, a skipped word, a name slightly altered. But some are significant enough to change meaning. The story of the woman caught in adultery, where Jesus says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," one of the most quoted passages in the New Testament, does not appear in the oldest surviving manuscripts. The scholarly consensus is that it was added sometime in the early medieval period. The final 12 verses of Mark, which include resurrection appearances, are also absent from the earliest texts we have. The text has a human history. Tracing that history is one of the most serious academic disciplines in the world, and it keeps producing surprises, which means the question of who wrote the Bible doesn't have a clean ending. But what we've found does have a shape. There's a version of this story that's framed as a takedown, proof the whole thing was invented, a case for the prosecution. The evidence doesn't support that framing. Knowing the Torah came from 4 sources doesn't make the Torah less demanding. Knowing that Luke borrowed from Mark doesn't make the parables less precise. Knowing that scribes added verses doesn't erase what the verses contain. What it does is make the Bible genuinely more interesting, because it means that across 1,500 years, across empires that rose and collapsed, across languages and droughts and plagues and wars, generation after generation of human beings kept returning to the same questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What do we owe each other? What do we do with our dead? The answers in the text shifted. The questions underneath them didn't. A lot of people wrote the Bible over a very long time, arguing with each other, borrowing from each other, editing each other's work, and trying to make sense of the same things people are still trying to make sense of now. That's not a weakness in the book. It might be why it lasted. If you want to go deeper, the Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything scholars thought they knew about how the Old Testament was transmitted. That's the next video on screen. Subscribe if this is the kind of history you want more of. I'll see you there.